Hello, I'm David Morris. Welcome back to Risk, where I'm reading from my book, A New Era of Risk. And if you've just joined me for the first time, this is not a bad time to be joining because I'm just summarising the key risks that are making the world a very unpredictable and complex place at this time in the 2020s. And so we talked in previous episodes about the geopolitical contest that's underway, about the dramatic changes in the international economy, risks in technologies that we don't seem to be able to grapple with. And of course, today I'm going to continue with some other risks that are happening at the same time. And one of those, of course, is the crisis in the climate that we kind of know about, but we don't really focus on every day on a day-to-day basis because it's moving slowly, but it's happening. Now, just before the dramatic shift geopolitical contest of recent years in 2015, global leaders assembled in New York to adopt the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in its ambitious set of 17 goals called the Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda, agreed by all the world's leaders, was a recognition of the interrelated nature of environmental, social and governance factors in achieving future development that is sustainable. So development prior to 2015 had been enormously successful. That period that we've talked about of globalization, of interdependence, we'd seen the rise of East Asian economies and most spectacularly China, and we'd seen hundreds of millions of people move out of poverty. So the Millennium Development Goals that the United Nations had set were achieved because of the dramatic improvement in development outcomes. But by 2015, it was very clear to the world, in particular to young people around the world, but really to anyone who thought about it, that the environmental risks are now so great that we need to integrate environmental goals with development goals, because the rise of China, the rise of India, this is changing the climate even more today than the historical impact of the traditional rich countries. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had been warning for decades of serious impacts on the global environment, food security and other challenges if human-induced global warming rises 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Also in 2015, global leaders agreed to pursue climate change mitigation, adaptation and finance for sustainable investment in an agreement that was called famously the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Yet, the world is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Goals. And global warming is actually looking like it's passing 1.5 degrees as we speak. And it's moving beyond possibly to 2 or 3 degrees global warming. By 2021, at the 26th meeting of the COP, as it's called, the Council of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, global leaders agreed the world must now move into emergency mode. Now, we don't hear very much about this, but this is well understood amongst political leaders that we are in a climate crisis. The action is the question. The call was barely noticed amongst the geopolitical and geoeconomic disruptions underway. And this is a key point I want to make, that we're in this climate crisis, but our mind is not on it. Our focus is elsewhere, on geopolitical competition, on all of the economic changes, and of course the economic changes are impacting people's lives, so it's perfectly natural that we're focusing on the day-to-day. But the environmental crisis is happening nonetheless, and as we'll see later, it's bound up in the Chinese strategies for their economic transformation. Climate risk has therefore become a high consequence and high likelihood risk in the medium term. Major structural shifts that are underway across most economies include a move away from polluting fossil fuel energy production to zero pollution renewable energy, zero emission vehicles, an end to deforestation, more sustainable agriculture, more efficient infrastructure and smart cities. As discussed previously, technological change as a result of the new high-speed connectivity across the so-called Internet of Things, driven by powerful AI and quantum computing, is anticipated to generate innovation in smart manufacturing, in logistics, consumption and reuse of materials to dramatically improve efficiencies and to reduce harmful impacts on the environment, bringing economic activity closer to a sustainable balance with the environment. That's the technological promise. Yet it is unclear if the green transition will take place fast enough to avoid cataclysmic climate change. With the US temporarily abandoning leadership on the climate challenge during the first Trump presidency, and we could say again during the second Trump presidency, the pullback of the US from leadership on the climate challenge, Europe has emerged as a leader in making the green transition. The cost of such a transition has been a barrier to action in the developing world. But in recent years, China has begun to play a leadership role in this area. This has been a long time coming, with China previously sheltering behind its self-proclaimed developing nation status to demand that the rich world take the lead, while meantime funding carbon-polluting projects across the developing world in a trade-off privileging development over sustainability. Nevertheless, consistent with China's more assertive actions across the agenda of global governance, China in the Xi era has not only rhetorically committed to achieving peak carbon emissions before 2030 and net zero carbon emissions by 2060, but it's in the process of dramatically restructuring its economy by which to achieve those goals. China leads the world in renewable energy investment and has ambitious plans for the rollout of sustainable infrastructure, including green transport, in which it appears likely to dominate global supply chains. Whether China's actions will be enough to help achieve the global sustainability agenda remains uncertain, but it is likely that the global sustainability agenda cannot succeed without China. Addressing climate change is therefore connected to the puzzle of solving the risks of interdependence with China. It is no longer adequate to assess environmental solutions as costs, but rather to integrate such solutions into the strategic goals of new investment. China has become the largest creditor for new infrastructure and other investment projects across the developing world. It therefore has both a giant stake and is likely to become a norm shaper in how and where such finance is deployed in the decades ahead. Whether China's investments in energy, road and rail infrastructure, ports and smart cities can meaningfully contribute to a new, more sustainable economic model will to some extent depend on the degree to which sustainability is central to design and strategy, a work in progress for Chinese as for other international investors. Whether such investment is coordinated across the international system or whether it becomes a feature of a new fragmented international order is unclear. The role of the state in any structural shift to green transformation may well be critical actually here, and the respective major powers' capabilities to manage climate risks may become one of the new areas of geopolitical competition. Now I'm going to take a sip of water so I don't lose my voice, but I want to continue here. European and US investment in renewable energy has been reliant on indispensable Chinese suppliers of equipment, from wind turbines and solar panels to electric vehicle batteries, generating controversy because of China's advantages from state subsidies and scale. The US has levied a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and the EU has followed with variable tariffs of its own to protect domestic industries that have become uncompetitive. Significant Chinese investment in Hungary, building a base at the centre of Europe for manufacturing electric vehicles and batteries, and similar investments in other regions will get around these new tariff barriers and will either complement other automakers by driving the green transition, or this Chinese investment may disrupt US and European industry in the decade ahead. Might be even less than a decade. In the deteriorating geopolitical climate, a further area of resistance to Chinese firms dominating global green value chains is that they include suppliers to the Chinese defense industry. Now, of course, US firms also commonly supply the US defence industry. So this is where geopolitics becomes murky. But it's likely to generate more political risks for businesses in future. Mitigating such risks by diversifying supply chains and reshoring, as it's called, by bolstering domestic industry will likely be pursued by those states with the capacity to do so. Chinese interests also dominate value chains in critical minerals for the new technologies that promise to aid the green transition. This leading market position is feared in the West and in the emerging international relations literature as a significant risk of future Chinese weaponization of interdependence in sustainability. If China was to turn off the access to critical minerals in the way that the US has turned off access to high technology to China, we could see problems on the road ahead. In Asia, new initiatives to mitigate such risks include development of new value chains in critical minerals, hydrogen and renewable energy, such as a proposed subsea link to supply Australian solar power to Singapore. Some other market shifts surrounding the raw materials for the green transition are mistakenly interpreted as geopolitical, when markets and actors are actually more diversified than simply the state of origin, such as, for example, some of the lithium suppliers are Chinese-owned companies, but they're actually supplying the lithium from Australia. So these issues are more complicated than just saying China controls the value chains, but increasingly there's a lot of truth to that as well. Now, there's another key risk here going on, and that is the risks of governance under strain. In the face of all these challenges, global governance is in crisis. The world is not on track to meet the UN's 2030 agenda, as we mentioned, despite the commitments made by governments. And while the UN remains the premier forum for world leaders to come together and to discuss global problems, such as climate change and others, it is only as effective as its most powerful member states wish it to be. Further, the major powers are drifting apart in their visions for international cooperation. The single great power of the post-Cold War era, the US, has waning enthusiasm for the inevitable negotiations and compromise that are inherent in multilateralism. Being part of the UN means compromise, and that doesn't come easily to major powers. This trend of the US stepping back from the United Nations dates back to the neoconservatives who gained significant influence after the shock of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, convinced that the US must wield its unilateral power to enforce its will, not only through warfare in the Middle East, but by departing or undermining new attempts at rulemaking, from the WTO to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US pulled out of, or the Paris Agreement on climate change, which, again, under President Trump, the US has stepped back from. The US has opposed any expansion of the mandate of the International Telecommunications Union to govern digital communications, and has even undermined the World Health Organization during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, all unthinkable to earlier generations that remember the United States as the champion of a rules-based order. China, meanwhile, has an ambition to become a rule setter and norm maker in global governance. It has created a number of new multilateral institutions. Wary of formal alliances and preferring rhetoric of peaceful coexistence, China formed a grouping of like-minded countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to address regional problems of terrorism, separatism and extremism, and to settle long-standing border disputes between member states. Long underrepresented in the global multilateral development banks, the World Bank and the IMF, China created a new regional institution, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to support infrastructure-led development. It has used its domestic policy banks to primarily fund around $1.5 trillion of development projects, many under the umbrella of its Belt and Road Initiative, more than the combined finance of the IMF and other World Bank members. So there's a change going on here in multilateralism, in the global system, and China is playing more of a role. Displaying ambition to shape global narratives and consistent with China's own brand of exceptionalism, believing that it has a special role to play, China's leaders propose a so-called community of shared future, a somewhat nebulous concept of a world without zero-sum geopolitical divide, although to be sure with China at the top table. China has also proposed a series of actions pursuant to a global development initiative and a global security initiative, which we'll talk about more later. It's early days for Chinese leadership in global governance and far too early to predict its prospects, but an ongoing war of narratives will likely frame the debates to come. In uncertainty about how those debates will play out on the ground, risks therefore abound. Worryingly, actually also at the national level in many countries, not only in the major powers but also in many other countries around the world, systems of governance appear unable to adapt and to manage the complexity of these geopolitical, economic, social and environmental changes that are underway. So our politics doesn't seem to be working. This is a refrain we're hearing all over the world. Leadership appears to be stuck in an early 20th century command and control model, spinning binary narratives spiced with large dollops of disinformation, lots of propaganda at the moment from all directions, rather than investing in complex systems knowledge and considered deliberation. We see governments that are provoking and fighting traditional wars rather than building new capabilities for cooperation. And domestically, seeing governments that are pitting interest groups against one another rather than catalysing partnerships that might innovate and lead sustainable new solutions to future problems. To varying degrees in powerful nation states across the world, authoritarianism, protectionism, populism and ethno-nationalism are being instinctively harnessed by leaders and their followers with no new strategies for the new conditions that we're in. The feedback loop of social media encourages such knee-jerk reactions, knee-jerk instincts, driving policy development based on emotion, based on fear, based on blame, based on supposed values and identity of certain groups, rather than common interests, mutual benefit scenarios, and any measurable outcomes. So understanding these new risks is going to be key to managing them. The complexity of the disruptions that are underway makes it impossible for international actors to confidently predict future scenarios. Our cognition is inevitably shaped by our previous experiences and theories developed to explain those experiences. But those experiences and theories were from a very different world than the world we confront in the 2020s or that awaits us by the 2050s. Even augmented by diverse and informed sources of complex information, we may still be seriously impaired in our traditional capacity to manage the new risks that are emerging. While pandemics and invasions are not impossible to predict, the shocks to the world in the early 2020s of COVID-19 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine underlined that we must be ready for more shocks that perhaps are predictable. And these shocks could ripple throughout international politics and the international economy. Indeed, future shocks are likely to be seismic shifts in the climate, in geopolitical power and in technology, with widespread, maybe unpredictable, and possibly universal impacts. It is therefore no longer realistic nor even safe to plan according to the past. The future state of the world is axiomatically uncertain and unlikely to follow traditional patterns. Disruption will be more likely the order of the day. For this reason, a new political risk approach is recommended to augment traditional literature, traditional scholarly approaches which have been based on traditional theories. I'm suggesting here we've got to take a risk approach and we've got to do scenario planning. Political risk has traditionally been restricted to the study of international business, but the international business environment is now inseparable from other dimensions of the international system. Understanding global and regional trends is critical at a time of global and regional disruptions. Nevertheless, it remains as important as ever to understand national governance, as only national governments hold the levers of power to be able to enforce measures and rules. Some nation states deploy those levers of power more effectively than others, some more transparently than others, and some are predetermined by the extraterritorial power of major powers, or those rare occasions when the international community agrees measures through the UN system. As we've seen in recent times, disruptive change is the new normal. I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back next time to Chapter 3 and we'll talk more about China.